welcoming you to the webinar, Being Conscious About Bias, the Role of Bystanders. As was mentioned, my name is Amorell Saunders and I'm pleased to be a partner in the search firm KBRS. I'm also the lead for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. KBRS is located in Halifax, and I work out of the Toronto, Ontario office. So pleased to be with you. I had actually been looking forward to being with you physically, but how the world has changed in over 6 weeks, and now this is the virtual environment that we're working in. I also want to take a moment just to acknowledge, in addition to working in a pandemic environment, the tragic circumstances that has impacted the province of Nova Scotia. And so my thoughts and prayers are with all those who've been impacted and the additional difficulty of the moment. And when we talk about bystanders, a lot of time that can be a triggering word, particularly if one has been involved or been a witness to tragedy. But for today's webinar and conversation, when we do talk about bystanders, it's in the context of the workplace. So I just want to make sure that that is clear. I've got quite a bit of content and information to share with you this afternoon. And while it's online, I do certainly want all who are joining me this afternoon to participate, to engage. So don't be shy. Please feel free to use the Q&A function. And if you have a comment or agree with a comment, to use the raised hand function. What I'd like to do to start out is to just do a very brief recap of the session that I did do in person in Halifax on February 27th about what unconscious bias is and means. Then I want to get some input from you about what you think makes positive and good workplace culture and what doesn't. I'm going to spend some time talking about impediments to workplace culture. It's important when we talk about workplace culture to get grounded in some of the definitions. And so I'm going to be relying quite a bit on some of the information that can be found on the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission website. It's a great place to get information about human rights, about bias, discrimination, and all the other areas that we're going to be talking about. Then we'll spend time talking about bystanders, active bystanders or passive bystanders, and close by taking a look at the role of bystanders given the pandemic environment that we're working in. All right, let's move ahead. So when I did the session in February, we got grounding on what unconscious bias is. You hear the term used a lot, and I think it's really important that when we're talking about unconscious bias, that we use a common definition. And so really when we talk about that term, it's the use of stereotypes to form preconceived judgments, expectations about people's capabilities or characteristics. A lot of that is grounded in stereotypes that have been formed by the way we socialize and a lot of other factors. There are many forms of unconscious bias, and these biases really lead to inaccurate and harmful outcomes, particularly for underrepresented groups. Moving ahead. So, what influences our unconscious bias? What is the impact in our workplace? First, I want to say that we all have bias. It's part of who we are as humans. And so we shouldn't be defensive about it. I think where we run into issues around unconscious bias is where we adversely use this bias to negatively impact the way others interact or live or experience themselves in the workplace, right? So sometimes that quick thinking, unconscious decisions are really influenced by not only the way we were brought up, the experiences, our lived experience, sometimes the education, and quite a lot of times the media. Um, the way the media propagates stereotypes about certain groups, cultures, races, that all plays a part in how unconscious bias flourishes in the workplace. And so these bias decisions, if you're not critically aware of them and aren't actively making steps to mitigate them, can really lead to errors in judgment and can lead to discrimination. And that contributes to inequality and a lack of diversity and inclusion among certain groups. So what I also want to reinforce during our time together is I'll be checking as we go through this session for any questions that you may have. So I'm not going to pull them till the very end of the session. I want you to be as engaged as possible. So if you could please throughout any questions you have or any comments you want to make, we'll be watching for those, and I invite you to participate. There are many different types of biases that affect decision making. For the purposes of focusing on the work environment, we talked about similarity bias, experience bias, distance bias, and safety bias, and I'll spend a minute explaining what those are. And I do believe that you have access to the presentation that I made in February through Engineers Nova Scotia. So if you want to get details about unconscious bias and what I presented a couple of months ago, please be in touch with Engineers Nova Scotia. If it isn't already, I think it's already on the website. So when we talk about similarity bias, it's really talking about we prefer what is like us over what is different. So these five biases really talk about a level of comfort and sort of the status quo, the fit that impacts decision making. When we talk about experience bias, we, you know, prefer to act quickly than to sort of take time to perhaps research or engage or get different points of view. We, I think, our human nature likes us to respond quickly and act quickly. And sometimes in doing that, our biases can get the better of us in our decision making. Experience bias talks about we take our perception, what we've experienced to be the truth. So a lot of times our decisions are based on past or previous experience. And we say, well, I've experienced this before, so this must be true. Again, it goes to a place of comfort, of expedience. Distance bias, we prefer what's close to us over what's further away. So that could be friends, people that you're comfortable working with as opposed to maybe a different department, etc. And safety bias talks about protecting against loss more than seeking out gain. So perhaps that talks about being comfortable with what you have as opposed to taking a risk, that safety bias. So those were some of the um, topics that I spoke about, and I think those are relevant for our conversation this afternoon. So let me start by having you use the Q&A function to get your thoughts about what are characteristics of a good workplace. I am hoping that certainly you have worked in them and you would know what makes a good workplace. Please share. I'm going to give you another minute. I've got some good input coming in. Thank you. Let's keep that going. Another minute or so. All right, let me start to share with the group the input. So characteristics of a good workplace includes communication, open communication through all levels, a broad variety of employees, mutual respect, respect of differences, and a variety of perspectives, and high morale and teamwork, clear expectations, uh, co-workers, let's see, co-workers and bosses and supervisors who welcome and appreciate being informed, even if the information may not be what they want to hear. So, well, yeah, so the appreciation and willingness to accept divergent or different points of view. So for me, some really critical takeaways are the importance of open and clear communications among all staff at all levels. That's that was a key theme. The importance of mutual respect and respect for differences, really important. And those types of respectful environments would lead to high morale and teamwork. And also having different people, a wide range and variety of employees. That's the diversity. And when diversity is celebrated and welcomed, it leads to an inclusive environment, which will lead to high morale and positive outcomes. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. I appreciate it. Let's think about what a poor workplace culture looks like. Please take a moment and share your thoughts on that. Again, if you can, please use the Q&A function to tell me what you think a poor work culture looks like. I'll give you a minute. And I'm hoping that none of you are in a current situation that would be constituted as a poor workplace. But if you think about the opposite of what positive work culture is, what would a negative one be? All right, some comments are starting to come in, I see. Don't be shy. Thank you. I'll give it a few more seconds. All right. Oh, well, we've got a lot here. All right, so thank you for sharing. Let me share out to the group. Um, Poor workplace culture involves a lack of trust. Um, uh, Environments where the culture is poor include where people feel afraid to speak up and to voice their opinions. There are toxic, co-workers, the mentality of personal gain over others that can contribute to a very poor workplace dynamic. Um, One where there's no diversity. And in the types of people working there can contribute to a poor working environment. Also, when people don't feel safe, and they don't trust one another, that contributes to what we often call a poisonous work environment. Lack of communication, where no one talks to one another. You show up at work, you do your job, and then you go home. So there's no sense of team or camaraderie. That can be actually very draining, not only physically but mentally as well. Where the blame game is tossed around, and again, where employees don't feel comfortable to be who they really are. There's this term that's often used, bringing your whole self to work. And in environments where you're allowed to express yourself and be your true authentic self, those tend to be really positive and supportive work cultures. But where that is not encouraged and people feel that they're just a number, or they're just there to do a job and people aren't listening to them, that is where poor work environments happen. You will notice some of the characteristics of those types of environments include high turnover, absenteeism, um, sick time are usually quite high in work cultures that exhibit some of these characteristics. So important to avoid these types of workplaces. And in fact, I would say our topic today, bystander, bystanders can play a key role in making sure that these types of behaviors aren't allowed to flourish in the workplace. So thank you very much. I really appreciated you sharing. I want this to continue during our time together. So we see that there are certainly a lot of impediments to an effective, a positive, a vibrant work culture for our purposes today, because they speak very much about how bystanders can engage. I'd like to focus on five key impediments: bullying, harassment, discrimination, racism, and abuse of power and privilege. All right, so, and I'm sure these are all terms and phrases that you might have heard. I am sincerely hoping that um, you have not encountered any of these acts personally, but you know what? Sad but true. Many workplaces suffer from any of these. It's really incumbent on not only organizational leaders, but also those who work within the work environment to check behavior. I think we all have a key role to play in making sure we're contributing to positive, supportive, healthy work environments. And so our ability to counter these kinds of impediments is important. So let's focus on each of these five and how they might impact the workplace. We've heard about bullying, certainly, particularly at school, but sadly, it happens um, in the workplace as well. And towards the end of our session, I'm going to talk about how it can happen online, because most of us are working online. So when we talk about bullying, really, it's it's somebody exhibiting inappropriate behavior over somebody, and that could be physical, it could be verbal. Um, these are repeated incidents. It's a pattern of behavior that really, is intended to intimidate, offend, degrade, or humiliate another person or a group. Um, and it can also involve like negative physical contact, and that is really someone trying to assert their power through aggression. And I mean, you can think of a moment to think of, someone who you would consider a bully. Does anyone want to share? Perhaps someone maybe in the public or maybe well known who is characterized as a bully or has bullying behaviors? Anyone come to mind who you've thought, oh, that person acts like a bully? Yeah, okay. Unanimous feedback. The President of the United States of America. Okay. All right. That's who he was the first one who came to mind. And while we're going through these definitions, I'm just going to say that they are from the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. At the end, I'll share with you some references and resources. And the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission has a great website and really good resources that can help you um, navigate and understand some of the definitions and the issues that we're speaking about today. So moving on to harassment, there are many different forms of harassment, and it's a course or a comment or conduct which is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. So on that point, it's not about the victim of harassment. It's the perpetrator who should know better, who should know that their behavior, that their conduct is unwelcome and inappropriate. Um, and there are characteristics that are protected that I'll mention in a moment. And workplace harassment can occur as objectionable or unprofessional conduct or comment directed towards a specific individual. And sometimes harassment in the workplace leads to intimidating, humiliating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So I want to talk about and clarify when there's input or feedback. So a supervisor who is providing constructive criticism on work performance, that would not be considered harassment. Unless, of course, the nature of how the supervisor was delivering that feedback was offensive in some way, inappropriate language, hostile, that could be harassment. But a supervisor or a manager sharing or providing input into how somebody is performing, that is not considered harassment. Now, you may not like the input being received, but you cannot, based on perhaps your dislike of a supervisor or manager, claim to be harassed if the manager or supervisor was doing their duty in providing constructive input and feedback to you. Clear? All right, let's move on. Discrimination. Discrimination is treating someone differently so that it has a disadvantage to that person or group. Now, when we talk about discrimination, um, sometimes you talk about equity. So sometimes in order to get a person to um, be treated equitably, um, they need to be treated differently. So we're not all the same. We might need different accommodations to be able to participate in an activity or in the workplace. When we talk about discrimination, however, what we're talking about is somebody perhaps using stereotypes or their bias to make decisions that adversely impact a member of a group or an individual that results in not being able to fully participate in opportunities. That is what discrimination is. And they're different, and here again, there are different forms of discrimination, such as racial discrimination. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about the way certain groups, individuals are are treated. So and that again has a lot to do with bias. You assign differential value to people according to their race. And this results in behavior that humiliates, intimidates, and isolates and excludes people from being able to fully function in society, and whether that's in the educational system or in the workplace. And I know recently the province of Nova Scotia has been taking steps to address some issues of racism, of trying to redress some of those issues. We know that as a country, we've been working hard around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address some of the historical wrongs that have been meted out to our Indigenous peoples. So that's an example of racism. Okay. What a key part of impediment to having a really strong and healthy workplace culture is the abuse of power and privilege. And I know when I asked about what constitutes, sort of poor work environment, those of you who shared your comments and thoughts alluded to this, that there might be people who do not listen to the employees or don't welcome their thoughts. And the role of power and privilege really does impact the work environment. And it can impact the work environment either positively or negatively, right? So, power, you possess control and influence or authority, and your privilege because there's a right or an advantage that's available to only a particular group of people. So um, oftentimes the power part has to do with the relationship. So it could be the boss employee relationship. The privileged person could perhaps be an owner of the company or may be perceived to be highly influential in the company. A lot of times you see abuse of power. It manifests in, the organizational authority. So whether it's your professional status, uh, and that could be how many degrees you have, the level of educational attainment that gives you a certain level of power and privilege that sometimes can be used to, um, wield unhealthy power over a group or over an individual in the workplace. Your social status, the cultural group you belong to, sort of that power group. When you look at society and you take a look at who is really wielding power, by and large, that sort of group looks a lot different than a lot of groups who are trying to seek power or control or equity. So those equity seeking groups, whether they're women, members of religious groups, LGBTQ community, racialized people, one would argue that they have less power and privilege than the dominant group, right? Your religious affiliation can also impact power, as well as your physical size. Can anyone think of an example of abuse of power and privilege in society in general? How do you see this playing out? Okay, Donald Trump. It's a great example of abuse of power and privilege. Depending on the day of the week, he can claim to have absolute authority over decision making for the country, and he also has nepotistic tendencies because his children, he's given a lot of power and privilege to his children. So that's a blatant example of the abuse of power and privilege. Before we start to focus on the role of bystanders, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the grounds on which discrimination is just not allowed. There are 20 grounds, and it's not just not just in employment, but also access to housing and access to public services. And I think this is important because um, for all of us who want to present and be our whole selves at work, it's important to know your rights. And when you consider serving in the role of a bystander, it's important to know, the grounds that are for discrimination. So there are 20 of them. And again, definitions are provided on the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission website. So they run the gamut, of course, age, race, creed, sex, sexual orientation, ability, family status. That's whether you're from a single family home or married. Harassment, we talked about, and that can include sexual harassment. This one is interesting: the irrational fear of contracting an illness or disease. And how relevant is that in our COVID-19 times? So, one cannot discriminate against a person if they fear contracting an illness or disease. So if somebody is, wanting to protect themselves because they have this fear of getting sick, you cannot discriminate against that person. That's against the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. The other one that I thought was important to talk about was retaliation, because this is important. You cannot discriminate against a person um, because of retaliation that's related to a human rights complaint. So if you happen to be, let's say, a manager, a boss, and you received um, a complaint or notice that a member of your staff was going to be filing a complaint based on the fact that they felt they had been discriminated against on any of those grounds that you see on the screen, you cannot then start to retaliate against that person. That's against the Human Rights Act. Is that clear? Okay, what is meant by creed? Okay, so it's similar to religion, but if you do not have, if you're not a member of a formal or prescribed um, religion, but you believe in different beliefs that may be spiritually based, that is called creed. Any other questions about the definitions that I've shared here? Oh, okay. I did. Yeah, I defined retaliate because that was a flag for me, why retaliation would be on this list. But it's retaliation in relation to a human rights complaint. It's not retaliation if someone, you know, did something wrong to you and you want to retaliate. It's not that. It's based solely on someone who's filed a complaint, and then the person who is involved in the complaint cannot retaliate against that person. So that is creating the conditions of safety for people to feel safe if they feel that they are in a toxic work environment where they're being discriminated against or bullied, that they should feel safe enough to go or raise a complaint without the threat of retaliation. All right, let's move on then to talk about the role of bystanders. So, very simply defined, A bystander is someone who observes an incident, a conflict, or an event. And I think we are all bystanders. It's a role that I think we play in life and as well as in the workplace. An active bystander takes action that can make a difference. So that's the distinction between just being um, witness to or observing an incident, a conflict, or event, and actually taking action that can impact what happens. That's the difference. Um, and when we talk about bystanders in the work environment, one could be like a whistleblower. There are usually laws to protect people who actually serve in the role of active bystanders, right? So organizations, I would say, should have processes, policies, mechanisms in place to protect people who actually engage in wanting to correct behaviors, attitudes, to make the workplace culture more positive, more vibrant. Very important. Um, can I ask, can anyone think of perhaps someone in the public domain who you would consider an active bystander, perhaps, and who's gotten notoriety as a result of their taking action to make a difference? Does anyone come to mind? Snowden, Eric Snowden, right? Yes. Where he shared information about what the US government was doing. Yes. And there's been documentaries and movies made about him. Greta Thunberg, yes, the teenage environmentalist. Yeah, we've got, three for Greta. She's a great and current example of an active bystander who is certainly making a huge difference in how we think about the environment and the role that we play in it. So that's good. So Eric Snowden, Greta. Okay. Yes, the MP in the SNC Lavalin affair. Um, that happened last year. Okay, hold on. Um, she was the Minister of Justice, who is now sitting as an independent, and she's from out west. If someone could Google her name and share it with the group, that would be great. Yes, yeah. Jody Wilson Raybould. Jody Wilson Raybould. Yes, that's right. And do you see? Thank you for sharing. So, do you see the importance of active engagement to make a difference, to have a positive outcome? When one chooses to not engage, perhaps the truth doesn't come out, or we don't hold those in positions of power and authority, accountable. And the people that we've mentioned here have actually, I'd say, done a great service in raising awareness. And a lot of times, being an active bystander, that's the role you play. Thanks for your input. I appreciate that. All right, being an active bystander. It's, I would say, a lot of times easier said than done. It can often require bravery, courage, um, a risk. A lot of times people make these decisions to act out of great personal risk and loss. And when you think about Eric Snowden, he had to actually leave his family, his home in America. And so that came at a great personal sacrifice. Um, there are world leaders who don't take kindly to Greta Thunberg's impassioned advocacy around environmental issues. And Jody Wilson-Raybould also made sacrifices. She's no longer a member of like a, you know, the ruling party. She sits on her own. I think at the time she was ostracized for, um, going by her values and her principles, right? So when one is thinking about being an active bystander, particularly in the workplace, there are certainly a lot of issues that you need to work through, right? The first one I think is, are you what's your comfort level with engaging? Are you really ready to step in, to speak up, to put your hand up, to file a complaint, to gather information? It really depends on, I would say, the context that you find yourself in the workplace, the team dynamics that's really at play. So, depending on your role within the work environment, you may not be ready. So I ask this to say, what might some of the questions you'd ask yourself be to help you decide whether or not it's appropriate for you to take action? Can you share? Can you take a minute to think about what conditions might need to be right or what you'd need to consider to be an active bystander? And again, I invite you to use the Q&A section. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. So, some of the considerations is anyone harmed by my inaction? Am I doing the right thing? Um, is the situation repeating itself? So is this sort of an ongoing, sort of chronic issue where an intervention is required? Another good point is, what's the risk to myself, my family, my job? Will my taking a stand even lead to positive change? And that is such a great point. Thank you for sharing that, because a lot of times one needs to weigh the sort of the risk with the reward. And those are all really important considerations to make. If I step in, how's that going to impact myself? Is it safe for me or even my family? Because perhaps by me, stepping in, they might know my family, perhaps they might be compromised. What if that impacts my job? Although, if you're in Nova Scotia and you speak up, you're covered under the retaliation part of the act. But perhaps you work elsewhere where they don't have those really strong and supportive legislation to back you. And then you think, based on your position and the role power and privilege play in the work environment, will taking a stand even lead to positive change, right? So a lot of times people choose not to act because they're thinking the risks of me doing that, really, I don't see a benefit. And that's unfortunately. That's unfortunate. Um, Another point is, you may not know what constitutes an appropriate action to take in the moment, in the situation. And so in not knowing that, you may decide to not do anything. So and it's also, this is a good point, recognizing what a real bias is and not trying to be politically politically correct. Let me speak about that. So a lot of times people will say, you know what, the work environment has changed so much, I'm afraid to even make a joke or comment on a coworker's appearance because it might be misinterpreted or misunderstood. And when we consider the time of the hashtag Me Too movement, and increased awareness around harassment and sexual harassment, um, some people might decide to do nothing because they don't want to get involved and they don't want to be seen to be politically correct. I think by and large, though, most people want to do the right thing and they want to work in an environment that where there's no bullying, there's no discrimination, there is no harassment. And I do say that we all play a role in contributing to healthy workplace dynamics. And if one feels uncomfortable in knowing what to do, I think this is where creating an environment of open communication, where dialogue is welcome, where differences of opinion are welcomed respectfully. That's what contributes to positive work environments. So those are all really important and you know considerations to make around whether or not you're going to be an active bystander and you know try and take an action with the goal of helping to make a positive outcome. Those are important considerations. So, if you're not sure, I think it's important to ask, open-ended questions. If someone's made a comment that might be offensive to some, I think it's, saying that's an important or interesting comment. Tell me more about that. And when you get them to reflect or think about what they've said, sometimes they might change their behavior. A lot of times I've found that, behaviors have been led to flourish in the environment because people were afraid or, felt uncomfortable. And it just takes a moment of someone asking for clarification or asking someone to say more about their point of view that light bulbs start to go off for people, right? So sometimes silence is not helpful. Perhaps the person is just ignorant about what they're saying. And in the silence of colleagues or coworkers, they might misinterpret that silence as consent and acceptance, and it's not, right? Um, another open-ended question that you might want to ask to get people clarity is, what were you really trying to say when you made that statement? So in saying something like that, you're sending signals that the comment that was made was not appropriate without being so blatant about saying that was an inappropriate comment, because people a lot of times get really defensive. And I've seen this happen in workplaces, in meetings, where someone has made a comment that I felt might be inappropriate or might be injurious to a group. And what I've done is I've raised my hand and I've said, I'm sorry, it's got to be me. Is what you're saying this? And then I repeat what they say, and clearly then usually they'll say, no, 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 that's not what I said, this is what I meant, right? So giving people an opportunity to clarify and confirm and reflect on what they've said is, is a form of being an active bystander. All right, so if you decide that I'm going to go out on a limb, I'm going to believe that I'm going to be supported in being a bystander, it's important to engage early and to share your opinion respectfully, right? So we talked about, has this been ongoing, right? So like I said, if it's been an ongoing situation, the perpetrator might actually have felt, well, no one's saying anything. No one's interjecting, or so this behavior is, acceptable. So the earlier you can, raise your hand or share your opinion in a respectful way, I think the faster bad behavior gets shut down. So another way that you can be a bystander is to avoid indications of support. So, what can that look like? Indicators of support. Can you think of um, indicators of support that might send the wrong signals to someone who's being a bully or being a harasser in the workplace? Think about what that might look like. Great, we've got one. Someone said nodding. That is the easiest one. So you might be in a meeting and someone is saying something that's derogatory to another group and you feel uncomfortable, but your head's going like this, even though you know that you totally disagree. Just sort of a nervous, awkward head nodding is an indication of support, even though you don't agree with that. Okay, that's a good one. What else do we have? Laughing at an inappropriate joke. That is another, sadly, avoidable indicator of support. So someone's making perhaps a sexist or racist joke and it's uncomfortable for you and you don't know what to do and you're like even though you're horrified by it, right? And sometimes we do this because in the heat of the moment, in the situation, it's these sort of quick acting decisions where you don't have time to like think about what you're doing, and impulsively you might start laughing. That that shows support, inadvertent support. So that is a that those are good comments. Saying nothing when obviously everyone is looking at the floor after someone has said something that was inappropriate, or said the wrong thing. Sadly, this happens a lot. So um, I've worked in places where this has occurred, and it's an awkward moment, and a lot of times my colleagues will look to me because I'm usually ready with a quip, or I'm the one to ask those open-ended questions to say, did you really mean to say that? Because this is what I took from it. So you know, it can take courage and you need to be prepared to act in the moment, but avoiding those indicators of support is really important. And you know what? Silence. So if you say nothing, even though somebody's inappropriately using their power or their privilege or their role to denigrate someone or to insult someone or to intimidate, and you say nothing, that could indicate to the perpetrator, well, I've got support. Right. So other ways that you can be an active bystander is not to make assumptions or even engage in gossip. And to avoid making assumptions, it's important to ask those open-ended questions, to clarify and confirm, to even say, I don't share your point of view. In my opinion, I feel this way. And also important to keep those conversations polite and non-offensive. But I reinforce again, I think it's important. You need to be able to feel comfortable and supported in your work environment and able to do that. Because sometimes, depending on where you work, you may be targeted as, the person, the politically correct person, the killjoy, the left leaning, like advocate. And that's not what we're trying to do here. What we're really talking about is ways in which we can contribute to those healthy workplace behaviors by taking responsibility um, for what the work environment looks like, right? To ensure that we're making sure that the environment is respectful, that people feel supported, that the environment of inclusion where differences of opinion and ideas are welcomed happens, right? So it's not really about going around and checking people on comments unless certainly they're inappropriate and they're not respectful or polite. But creating that atmosphere and environment where you know people's ideas and thoughts are welcomed, but they're welcomed in appropriate ways, and people's power and privilege and positions are used for the greater good, as opposed to being used to demonstrate, the privilege or the status that they may enjoy, right? That's very important. All right, so some hints and tips then, and then we're going to go into some scenarios. Now, again, important to note that you need to feel comfortable and supported, and one would hope that there are policies and processes in place in your work environment where you can actually actively engage in making sure that those who are, bullying or discriminating or harassing um, or abusing their power are called out. So a lot of times there's usually, the HR office, depending on the size of your of your organization. They might have specific offices that deal with equity, diversity, inclusion related complaints that you could go to. They might have an HR consultant that you might want to reach out to. And, there's also the Human Rights Commission. There are resources in the community if you don't feel safe engaging or seeking support at work. You can reach out to the community. So, what to do in the moment if you're, let's say, in a meeting or you're in the lunchroom and you observe an action or an incident that is clearly inappropriate and wrong. If you feel comfortable, you could name or call out the offense. And you can interrupt the offending behavior only if you feel comfortable and safe, of course, to do so. You can encourage conversation and offer support to the victim. I think that's a good act of being a bystander. And you can use your body language to show disapproval, right? So whether it's a startled look or puzzlement, there are different ways that you can use your body language to show that, what's happening in the moment is inappropriate. Folding of the hands, the head down, shaking, and then use humor carefully, right? Because again, the humor, depending on how it's used, could be seen to be accepting of the offensive behavior. But if you say something that gets the offender to think, like sarcasm, that that could be effective. Am I missing anything on here? Can any of you think of anything else that you might consider doing in the moment if you happen to be witness to an inappropriate, uh, you know, discussion, comment, action that might be considered offensive. Does this list look pretty good? All right. I hear silence. I see silence. So that means that you're in support of the list then. Moving on. Well, I think I missed a slide. So other ways that you might want to engage after the fact. Maybe you don't feel comfortable responding in the moment. So after the fact, you might want to have a private conversation with the aggrieved person or with the person who's behaving badly, right? After you've had some time to gather your thoughts. You might want to have a private conversation with the aggressor too. It depends. Maybe you know the person. It all depends on the relationship and how comfortable that you feel. I think it's important. And then if it's something that you feel would make a difference, report the incident. And here there are privacy and confidentiality considerations. So let's say the victim feels helpless and is afraid to bring a complaint forward, but you might want to act on their behalf. It would be important for you to get their consent to be able to do that, right? So you might want to report the incident, but if the victim, is feeling shy about it or doesn't want to bother go through the process, then that might take some time. Sometimes in the moment they're dealing with their emotions and their grief. You can't assume that reporting the incident will make the victim feel better if they are not ready to engage in what could be a lengthy process. Okay, so that's important. All right, we've got about it looks from my timing about 20 minutes left during our session, and so I would like to run some scenarios by you and to get your thoughts and your input on here. Let's take a look at them. Scenario 1. A colleague sends a disparaging email to a coworker, highly critical of their contributions to a project. Expletives and derogatory comments about the person's ethnicity are included in the communication, which is copied to all team members who work on the project. What would you do? Again, I invite you to use the Q&A section to share your thoughts. I'll give you a minute. All right, we're starting to get some comments in, and I'll share in a few moments. I invite those who haven't had an opportunity to make a comment or to share to please go ahead and do that. And I'd also like to say that I have really appreciated the contributions and the comments and the questions so far. I know this isn't an ideal forum for this type of engagement, but I do appreciate it, and I hope that you are benefiting from our time together this afternoon. All right. Someone made a good point and asked a question that I'd like to address before we talk about this particular scenario. We know that some large companies have sensitivity training through their HR department. What about companies that do not? That's a very good question. Um, for for companies who don't, I don't think it would hurt as part of professional development and ongoing development, much like Engineers Nova Scotia does, is to recommend such training, and that training might be outsourced. You may have to, take a half a day or a couple of hours of training, and now. In our online environment, there are a lot of training opportunities that are available online. So I think it would be helpful to make recommendations either to a supervisor manager or the person responsible for HR about some of the topics that could be offered to employees um, in order to help contribute to effective workplace culture and workplace dynamics. All right. Looking at scenario one, some of the comments that have come in, and thank you for them. I appreciate that. Talk to that individual in person and tell them that was inappropriate. That's very brave, and that's good. A lot of times, the easiest way to nip an offending behavior in the bud is to actually deal with it directly, but not all of us feel comfortable doing that or equipped to doing that. Again, we have to think about the risks involved, depending even on your tenure in the organization. Are you a new employee? Are you a long-standing employee? Do you have management? So a lot of times the status that you have within the organization can impact your role as bystander and how you choose to intervene. So that's important. Thank you for sharing that. If comfortable, I would engage that coworker highlighting his incorrect behavior. I think that's also helpful. We want to, wherever possible, give people the benefit of the doubt that they're well-meaning, well-intentioned, but sometimes they might just be oblivious, and they need to be called out on their inappropriate manner. Someone says the project manager needs to address this immediately by sitting down with the offending author. An email war never works. Very good point. Because you know what? The email, the back and forth could go on for a long time. So sometimes a face-to-face, and so we are challenged. So face-to-face could be online or a phone call. We're using our phones again more these days. Can nip the the issue in the bud, as opposed to a long stream of emails back and forth with varying opinions. All right, thank you for sharing. I would talk to the coworker who received the email and support them in contacting HR or discussing with our manager. Very, very good. A lot of times, the focus is on the perpetrator, the offender, as opposed to the victim. And it's really good to reach out and provide support to the victim so that they're not internalizing what they're feeling. Someone else says, reply only to the sender expressing your disapproval of their behavior. Very, very good. And imagine, the more people who do that, they quickly realize that that's inappropriate. Thank you. Call them in the office to explain that that is against human resources policy, but also try to understand why they felt the need to communicate that way. There may be some underlying issues, right? So, and you can get to those underlying issues by having that conversation. Thanks very much. That was great participation. Good job. I appreciate that. Okay, scenario number 2. At the weekly team meeting, the manager insists that the female members sit close to him so that he can keep an eye on them. He often comments on their wardrobe and will spend several minutes asking probing questions about their personal life, which makes the group uncomfortable. What would you do? Is this a tough one? Okay, good. I was getting concerned. All right. Yes, this is reported to HR. Yeah, yes. Um, Now this could be, here's a question. How is he still a manager, much less employed? True enough. That is a good point. Perhaps, in a lot small organizations where, let's say, it could be run by a small clique of let's say, well-established people who've been around for a year, where they're just now starting to bring on, a diversity of employees. This kind of behavior, sadly, has existed and continues to. Um, but when you call it out and you report it and you put the processes in place, this kind of behavior is stamped out. So it's not, it's not something that hasn't happened. You can think of Fox News and the movie that came out last year, Bombshell, that spoke to this very thing, right? Um, so talk to the female victims and likely take issues to outside HR organization because of the power dynamics in the structure. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Which speaks to what I just spoke about. Sometimes this could be entrenched behavior, and that you need to escalate it in a way that doesn't compromise the female staff. Yeah, really important if you're in the meeting to, like, say, can we keep this professional instead of, spending the time, asking about their personal life. Let's keep it professional, or can we please stick to the agenda, or I've got another meeting. Those kinds of, interrupters are really important to do. Um, Try to tell him that I don't have time to answer his questions to support the other women. Yes. Yeah, and then talk about respect. The importance of respect is also very, very important, right? And then ask the victim if they would feel comfortable with me submitting a complaint. That's excellent and a good support, right? Um, Particularly when you think of the gender dynamics, if a male coworker is stepping up to support female victims, that sends supportive signals. Thank you, everyone. The last one last scenario. A job posting for a supervisory position is sent to a list of internal candidates drafted by the project lead. There are 15 recipients out of a team of 35, most of whom would be considered qualified for the position. The email asks that those interested reach out to the project lead personally and not to discuss or share the opportunity with others. What would you do? All right. Okay, so here's a question. Does the email show the people to whom it's sent? Yes or no? Could be. I would say yes, because you wouldn't want those 15 to forward it to the 20 who are excluded. Um, Remind them of the HR policies on how job postings are supposed to be processed, which usually include posting internally. Yep, absolutely. Sometimes you have to remind people that their process is here, right? Um, Someone says, I print off the email and post it in the kitchen. I love that act of defiance. That's fantastic. Um, yeah, it's fishy. There's something going on. It sounds like the project lead is trying to do a workaround to perhaps only identify people who they feel comfortable working with, right? A quick meeting with all, making sure all receive the same message. So this is a clear example of favoritism. Not good. For myself, hard to know how many are a good fit. So I will ask for criteria selection first, and after find what was sent to some and not all, right? Which is why in the scenario, I said most of whom would be considered qualified for the position. So in order to like be transparent, it would also be helpful to identify criteria, right? So that everyone could make a decision about whether they felt that they were comfortable or qualified for the role as well. Um, Sounds like a contravention of openness and diversity requirements. Absolutely. Um, Thank you. Those are the scenarios. And thank you very much, everyone, for participating and providing your input. I think you're all right on, and it sounds like you're already active bystanders, and that's great to know. In our remaining moments together, given our current work environment, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about um, being a bystander in our current pandemic environment, and we're primarily we're working online, and there might be some of us who might have experienced loss in hours or in work or in projects, um, and the importance of um, maintaining professionalism even as we work remotely. One issue that we need to talk about is cyberbullying, because many of us might be spending the majority of our days online. Cyberbullying is a form of harassment. We know that, and it includes hate speech, sexual remarks, stalking, trolling, and ridicule. I hope that none of you experience any of this, but it can be, a sad reality. And some of the most common victims of cyberbullying are women, and a majority of them do indicate feeling helpless, you know, when they are being bullied online. Also, during this pandemic, you might want to also consider which groups or individuals in society might be adversely impacted by the pandemic, and how can you go about supporting those groups or individuals? Um, and here, one thinks about those who may have just, received a layoff notice, or perhaps we know like women and children could be adversely impacted. We note that the incidence of violence against women is trending up during this time. And so think about actions that you could take as a bystander um, to offer support. And I know that people of Nova Scotia are going through quite a lot at this time. And so thinking of you during that. I want to leave you with a thought from Eli Wiesel, who was an American Romanian writer who's an advocate and a Holocaust survivor, who said, "What hurts the victim the most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander." So it's been a pleasure facilitating this webinar with you today. I do really appreciate your engagement and your thoughtful comments and responses to my request to engage. Thank you very much for that. Um, there's also some really good references that I used in pulling together the information that I shared with you this afternoon, including the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. It's a great website. They've got a fairly detailed glossary that covers all the definitions, and it provides scenarios, so it's really, really good. And the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety has some really good information as well on bullying and how to create safe and healthy workplaces. So in my closing remarks, I do wish each and every one of you well. I hope that each and every one of you is healthy and safe at this time and managing well. And again, my thoughts are with the entire province as you grieve the horrendous loss that happened over the weekend. So thanks again. I appreciated being with you today, and I hope that the next time that we're together, it will be in person in your beautiful province. Thank you.